Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this episode of TFL Classics. Now, a little bit of a different video for you today because behind me are two reliability legends, two vehicles that are known for going thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of miles before major issues, an old Mercedes diesel and the Toyota Camry. Now in this video, we're going to compare them side by side because why not? And we're going to find out which one is better. Now I'd love to tell you for sure that that car will last X number of miles, that car will last X number of miles, but they're just so hard to compare. I mean, reliability depends so much on who owns the car, who takes care of the car, how the car is used, the kind of environment it lives in. There's just so many factors that determine how long a car can last. It's going to be really hard to say which one of these cars will actually stay on the road longer. But what I've done is I've created a poll over at the TFL Classics community page, and I want to hear your opinion. It's a simple vote and let me know which one of these two you think is going to spend the most time on the road, the most number of years chugging down the highway. Now let's start talking about why these cars have such a reputation for longevity and some of the pros and cons of both of them. I'm going to start by popping the hood of the old Mercedes. This Mercedes is known as the W123. Now the W123 was sold between about 1976 and 1986, depending on where you lived in the world, and it was sold all around the world. They sold over 2.7 million of these cars, or about 2.7 million, which is a huge number of vehicles, and they had a huge number of engine choices. So to pop the hood, pull the latch, and you lift the giant steel hood. Now here in the United States, you could get a bunch of different power plants, but they're primarily known for their diesels here, and primarily two different diesels, the 240D and the 300D. Now this is actually a 300D with a turbo, so it's a turbo diesel engine. And it's a kind of an interesting thing to think about that, you know, almost 40 years later, there was a time when if you wanted this body style, you could only get the diesel. In fact, this is an 82, and an 82, you couldn't even get a gasoline engine. But it's primarily these engines that have created such a reputation with this model. These engines are beautiful pieces of engineering. They are so simple and yet so robust all at the same time. Now, they're a mechanical diesel, so you don't actually need electricity flowing to the engine for it to continue running. I could start this vehicle up, disconnect the alternator, pull out the battery, and it would keep running. It's incredible just how simple these vehicles were. Now they use something called a mechanical injection pump. It's this big, almost alien-looking contraption mounted on the side of the engine that determines which cylinder gets fuel when, and it's all mechanical, so there's no electronics to fail. And it's that lack of electronics that really made these engines so durable, and the fact that they had to be overbuilt. So these are basically like little industrial engines is the way I describe them, because they're just incredibly strong. They're also incredibly unpicky. You can run these on tons and tons of different fuels, and they'll just keep chugging for many years down the road. Just simple maintenance, and it doesn't keep much to keep these old beasts on the road. Now, they're also incredibly slow. So abroad, you could even get a 200 diesel, a 220 diesel, and then the 240 diesel. The number represents the displacement, but a 240D is something like 69 or 70 horsepower, and the car is a tank. So very, very heavy vehicles with not a lot of power. So don't expect to be rushing down the road. Now let's talk about what's under the hood of the Camry. Now this generation of Camry is also sold around the world. It's also available with a number of engine options, ranging from a 2-liter in some countries to this engine, the base engine here in the States, a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder, and then you can also get V6s, and this one even has all-wheel drive. Now this is another simple engine. It's not as simple as the old Mercedes engine, but it's simple by modern 2020 standards. Emissions requirements have gone up dramatically since the 1980s. Safety requirements have gone up dramatically since the 1980s. As such, you can't build an engine to that exact specification anymore. It wouldn't be allowed. It pollutes way too much. Now this new gasoline engine though, like I said, is pretty simple by 2020 standards. There's no turbocharging, there's no supercharging. It's just a very simple fuel injected 4-cylinder unit, and that is kind of the magic in the Camry as well. It's It's a simple, easy to work on vehicle, and parts are everywhere because they have built millions upon millions of Camrys over the generations they've been on the road. And Toyota is very slow to evolve. They get criticized a lot in the automotive industry for, being a little bit behind the game, but the reason that they stay kind of on the trailing edge of the curve for technology is because they want to make sure they can nail it, and they want to make sure they can deliver performance for many years down the road. Now, let's go back to the old Benz and kind of talk about the body and the construction. Very simple design, obviously. This is kind of the pinnacle 3-box sedan design. And as I close this hood, very squared off, very no nonsense. I think it's also very handsome in its proportions. It's interesting, cars of this era really had a lot of rust issues, and the W123 Mercedes, was no exception to some extent, but it's kind of uncommon to see these with the same amount of rust that their Japanese counterparts had. They were made out of incredibly thick steel. You can tell that by the door close quality. Very solid feeling door close. But once again, a very simple design, not a lot to go wrong on the exterior. If they get hit, if they get banged to, they are simple vehicles to repair. And it's that basic, no-nonsense kind of ease of use that mean these cars stay on the road forever. So the way that this worked is you saw a lot of these cars throughout Europe, Western Europe in the 1980s, and then of course in the States. But if you look at like the vehicles sold new in Germany as taxi cabs, they started out as taxi cabs in Western Germany, and then they aged to a point where they were brought out of commission, and then a lot of them ended up in far Eastern Europe, places like Romania, Albania. They were used for many, many years to come, and when they became so worn out that they didn't meet the needs of those the folks out in like Romania, for example, they would be shipped and resold into Northern Africa, places like Morocco and throughout many of the Northern African continents. So even 40 years after these cars were new, it's still very common to see these putting down used every single day throughout many countries in Africa, which is just crazy to think about. And they're even used today as taxi cabs. Not quite as frequent as a few years ago, but still a very common sight on their roads. Typically, they're not like the 300D turbo diesels. Typically, they're in much worse shape than this car, but oftentimes they have 5, 6, 7, even 1 million miles on them. Think about that, 1 million miles on a car. And things do go wrong, a lot of things go wrong, but the powertrain on these old Mercedes is what made them so indestructible. So I'm going to put it to you this way. Everything will fail on them. The climate control system will fail, door locks will fail, window regulators will fail, but the thing that you need to cruise down a road, the engine, the transmission, the differential, the steering, the basic suspension, they will pretty much always get you home. I mean, you may not get home air conditioned with power door locks functioning, but an old W123, even in the worst condition, will probably keep chugging along, belching smoke out the back, but you can pretty much always count on one of these guys to get you home. Now, the new Camry, obviously the design on this one is much more sporty than older Toyotas, especially the Camry. For when this vehicle launched like 3 years ago, they've really brought a lot of flair into it. So we've got these, crazy ducting and vents, and even have a spoiler on this one. This one is quad exhaust. Look at that, a Camry with 4 exhausts and a 4-cylinder. It even has a rear diffuser. So if you go to like a place like maybe Thailand or some place where the roads are less developed, this car could potentially, in this configuration, give you issues, because if you look like along the side here, not a huge amount of ground clearance. This one is, we got the sporty suspension and the big, huge 19-inch wheels. And actually, if you just compare it to the Mercedes, look at the height difference in the front end. The Camry sits so much lower, and that's fine for American roads, but abroad, I assume that there are different configurations with more ground clearance. I could be wrong about that. Let me know in the comment section below, but there's just not a lot of height for rough roads, whereas even these old Mercedes had just buckets and buckets and buckets of ground clearance. And actually certain export cars from Germany even sat higher than this one does, so that's pretty wild to think about. Bumper designs have changed a lot too. So back in the 80s, the US had mandated these big bumpers that extrude from the front of the vehicle to take impacts, and they're not very elegant, but they worked. I mean, you could run this bumper into something at 5, even in some cases 10 miles an hour, and you would be left with no damage whatsoever. On the new Camry here, the bumper is incorporated behind the front grille. It's all kind of one big unit, so a small collision in this could result in an expensive repair. I mean, look, the first thing you notice here is a camera that could potentially get damaged and break in even a minor fender bender, whereas in the Mercedes, not much to break with the big chrome bumper metal strip. All right, now let's take a look on the inside. So opening the door, the key on the Merc, standard blade style. Put the key in the door and open it up. And those seats are a little bit interesting. They're made out of a material called MB-Tex, and MB-Tex is impervious to pretty much everything. Hundreds of thousands of miles of use, dogs, gunfights, knife battles. I mean, there's almost nothing that'll break through the Mercedes MB-Tex interior. It's like a, I don't know, it's like a rubberized vinyl kind of. It's not actually a true leather. But stepping inside, everything you touch, even 40 years later, super high quality. Nothing that, you know, doesn't feel like it should have when it was new. It's amazing how well these interiors were constructed. But like I said, there are a lot of failure points on these cars that, you know, not a lot of people talk about. For example, the door locks, they're actuated by vacuum. So there's a vacuum pump on the engine that runs the door locks. A vacuum leak could cause the door locks to fail. A vacuum leak could cause the cruise control to fail. A vacuum leak will cause the transmission not to shift right. A vacuum leak could even prevent you from turning off the engine, because the shutoff for the engine is controlled by vacuum. This was a pretty big oversight by Mercedes, because even though the body, the engine, the transmission will last, like I said, 1,000,000 miles, the vacuum system just won't. The little plastic pipes will wear down in a road, and then something like a door lock failing could mean that your transmission won't shift right. It won't shift to the point where you can't get home typically, but it could leave you kind of herky-jerky in traffic. This car has some vacuum issues. Even though I've tried to do a pretty good job maintaining it, it still needs some work. But you know, very, very no nonsense. Huge steering wheel. Love the steering wheel. Love the gauges. The gauges are very analog, very mechanical, but they look really cool. And the startup procedure on these old Mercedes is kind of unusual. So you have to put the key in the ignition. It's another failure point, actually. The ignition barrels will wear down over time. And then you turn it on and wait for the glow plugs to warm up. And then you can start the engine and listen to the racket. Are you ready? Here, I'll hop around front so you can get a sense of just how loud this car is when it's idling. It's super loud. It really does sound like a John Deere. But once again, Mercedes in this era weren't as concerned with noise, vibration, and harshness. They were concerned about overall longevity. So that was the price you had to pay for a 1,000,000-mile engine, is kind of a funny thing. Now, stepping into the Camry interior, very different world. Of course, the key has gone to a proximity sensor on this XSE. You can see it here. These are pretty reliable, though. I think, you know, some of the older Toyota products that have had these for many, many years seem to keep working just fine, although you do have to replace the battery. Open it up. And the interior quality is beautiful. I mean, Toyota's done such a good job of stitching everything together, of securing various parts to other parts. Nothing rattles, nothing shakes. It's just a super well-made car. Engine stop-start button. Engine cruises into life. Now, obviously, a lot more tech in this engine. In this interior, we've got digital display. We've got tons of buttons here in the steering wheel for things like adaptive cruise control, lane keep assist. It's got all the safety functions. Here in the center, we do have a touchscreen display with full navigation as well. Automatic climate control, dual zone automatic climate control, wireless charger, transmission selector, and different drive modes ranging from eco, normal, sport, and even has ventilated seats. Ventilated seats in a Camry. Price on this one, almost $40,000. $39,635. Very nice interior, though. I will love to see how these seats hold up over several decades of use. See if they hold up as well as the old Mercedes. But I mean, Toyota does such a good job of building a car that lasts. And the door shut feeling, it's pretty good. It's a little bit more tinny than the old Merc, but pretty good. Now, speaking of body, even though this is a much more complicated design, I imagine it would be much harder to fix in a collision. Modern day rust proofing has improved dramatically, even since the 1980s. So I have a feeling that even in like a rust belt state, this car will last. Back seat, pretty good. One of the big drawbacks of the old Mercedes, as I'll show you in a sec, is the back seat. But the Camry is pretty good legroom. This is my driving position at 6'1". Headroom, it's compromised by the giant sunroof, but it's okay. It's not too bad. Let's check out the back seat in the old Merc. Now, this is an old car, and I do expect that, that it will need some service. So I do carry, basic safety things like fire extinguisher, toolkit, that kind of stuff. So I do it in a big bin. Even look at this. It's always handy to have some sunscreen on you. Now, this car is known for being the ultimate taxi throughout many countries in the world, which is hilarious because the back seat is terrible. By modern day standards, this is just a terrible back seat. This is my driving position at 6'1". I am jammed in here like a sardine. I don't have any headroom left to spare. My head is jammed into the ceiling. But cars have gotten bigger over the years, so you can't expect the same amount of room as you would have in the 80s. Do like the little nets. And in terms of ashtrays per seat, I can guarantee the Mercedes wins there. And what about trunks? Well, we'll start with the old Benz. Move this out of the way. No electronic trunk release. Push a button. Trunk will open up. There's my toolkit, but you can see just how simple it is back here. Not all that useful because the seat doesn't fold down, and it's a relatively small trunk by modern standards, but what I do love is they give you a proper full-size spare and everything you need to change the spare. And the other thing I love is just how easy everything is to access and replace in this car. So standard tail light bulbs, no LEDs, nothing like that, but look how easy it is to access them. 2 thumb screws, pull the panel out, and I've got every bulb just right there, simple to replace, cheap to replace as well. Spares on these old Mercedes diesels are surprisingly affordable. If you go any older than this car, they get really expensive. If you go too much newer than this car, they get really expensive, but these 80s Mercs can be relatively affordable when it comes to finding spare parts. That isn't say finding someone to work on one is easy, but it's a pretty simple car in its construction. All right, Camry time. Let's see what the trunk is like in the Toyota. So this one, where's the key here, does have an electronic trunk pop. There's a little button there, a little pad. Pop it open, you can see the trunk. Seats do fold down, so much more usable trunk. Mat lifts up here. Let's see if we have a full-size spare tire. I'd be surprised if we did. Looks like there is our tools for replacing the spare. Oh, horrible noise. Looks like it's not a full-size spare. At least it has a spare. So many modern cars don't have spares whatsoever, so trunk is much more usable in the Camry, even though the spare is not. All right, well, there we have it. Definitely an interesting comparison. Camry, much safer. Even though people call those old Mercedes tanks, they don't have any airbags for the most part. Most of them don't have ABS, whereas new cars have ABS and emergency braking and 100,000 airbags and stability control. And it's also much faster. That Mercedes 0 to 60 in like 15 seconds. Toyota's going to be quite a bit faster. It's going to drive better too, just much more nimble. Mercedes, though, is going to be better on rough roads because it's got a lot more ground clearance. It's got a suspension that was built to take constant abuse over washboards and holes and stuff in developing countries. I don't know about the Toyota, but it's a hard one to guess which one will actually last longer. Now, obviously, the Mercedes has a 38-year head start, so Toyota's got some catching up to do, but both beautifully well made. Just 2 kind of different philosophies, and as much as we like that Mercedes, something like that just simply can't be made, at least sold here in 2020 because of emissions regulations. You got to have the emissions requirements to sell cars here, and that just doesn't have it. Well, let me know what you think in the comment section below, and head over to the TFL Classics community page where we've got that poll running so you can vote on which one of these old reliable beasts will last longer. Okay, one old reliable beast and one brand new Toyota.